Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Donna Conwell.
And my name is Kelly Sicat, and we're your hosts of Scratch Space.
Scratch Space is a virtual forum hosted by the Lucas Artist Residency Program at Montalvo Arts Center, where we're bringing together visual artists, scholars, composers, activists, writers, and others to explore kinds of radical imaginaries can unfold in this moment of pandemic, racial reckoning, economic uncertainty, civil unrest, and environmental crisis.
We're interested in how we think about what's possible, how we use our imaginations to build a better present and future, and how we can retool and create better, more equitable models for living and working together. So who are we going to be speaking with today, Donna?
Well, I'm excited, Kelly. Today we're going to be talking with Monica Narula and Shudabrada Sengupta. Together with Jebes Bagchi, they are Raqs Media Collective, a Delhi-based collective founded in 1992. They've been described as artists, media practitioners, curators, researchers, editors, and catalysts of cultural processes. They create art, films, they curate exhibitions, they edit books, they collaborate with architects, computer programmers, and they also undertake publications and research. Most recently, they were the artistic directors of the Yokohama Triennial.
That sounds amazing. Because of the time difference between the US and India, this conversation is being pre-recorded. So we'll post links of our guests' full bios and any other pertinent information in the event description. There's a lot to talk about. So I'll disappear shortly, Donna, and you and Monica and Shuda can have a great chat for about 45 minutes, at which point I'll return.
Thank you, Kelly. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, Monica. Hi, Shuda. Thank you so much
Hi, Donna.
for being with us. We really appreciate it. So, I'd like to just start by asking you, how are you doing? Because the last time, Shuda, we spoke, it was just before the pandemic broke out. We were talking about you hopefully participating in a book project we were working on about the Lucas Artist Residency Program and residencies more generally. And our conversation was sort of very much interrupted and interspersed with this time of violence in the capital, with many Muslims injured and properties destroyed and killed and communities displaced. And there was a time of great uncertainty and tension, and we were very concerned for you. And so I just wanted to ask you both, how are you, and how is the artistic community doing during these days?
I was just going to say that sometimes we feel like we're living through that adage of interesting times, where one thing barely pauses and the next one starts. So some of the things that you are speaking about, which were happening 8 months ago, have now taken on a more complex form, more venal form, while of course the pandemic rages on. Isn't that Shudha?
Yeah, and I think it's this strange combination of both a kind of bleakness that everybody feels, but at the same time finding, and I suppose this is true in other places in the world as well, discovering new forms of solidarity, new forms of communion, which are also surprising. I mean, and I hope that they will actually outlast this situation of urgency. I mean, we are witnessing, as Monica said, an intensification in some ways in slow motion of the same processes that were happening in January, February. Now is the round of arrests and intimidation and trolling people on social media by the extreme right. All that's going on. But at the same time, people are still, there's a lot of pushback, and there is, even a kind of brazen hope.
That's really wonderful to hear. What are these kind of examples of solidarity that you are finding inspiring at this time?
Well, I think the first instance is that we all witnessed what we saw was the great migration from India's cities. Hundreds of thousands of of working people leaving the cities and going back towards their villages because the cities basically shut down for them, people who have precarious work. And there were, while this was a heartbreaking kind of scenario, there were also these instances of how strangers actually help people along the way with food, with water, with shelter, sometimes braving the full force of the law because this movement was unauthorized. The state created a condition where people could no longer remain, but then they were not allowed to leave.
Oh my God.
And if anyone tried to help them, they were actually in some ways breaking the regulations. But what was quite heartening to see was that people did help each other, did help the migrants. There were, of course, instances of venality, but I like to think that the fact that there was a residual humanity that reasserted itself was quite touching.
Yeah, that does give us hope. I mean, I think that's so true kind of everywhere right now in this moment, is this kind of dual feeling of the peril of this time, but also the possibility, and that, you know, the hope that we can find in how some people are responding.
Yeah.
And I hope that's something that can take us forward into the future, and we can move forward with more in that line and leave behind some of these more negative, destructive ones that we've been being with each other. So, you know, moving on now to sort of talk about your work with the Yokohama Triennial. That was one of the first, or it was one of those, maybe the first large-scale art events that opened up after the pandemic. And I'm wondering, like, why was it important for you to move forward with opening the Triennial at this moment? And also, what were the challenges and opportunities for installing and presenting such a large-scale exhibition at a distance?
Well, I think when the pandemic started, there was many people who sort of hoped or imagined or desired that this would be considered a blip in the way that our lives were running or ran, and that things would be contained and then things would go back to being quote unquote normal again, which is the way that we were all living up to that, or have been living for quite some time now. And I think two things happen. I think both the fact that in Yokohama there is, of course, in Japan there is a kind of a culture of fluidity and cleanliness and sort of maintaining distance, which is capable of dealing with this on an everyday level. So there was not that same anxiety about shutting down in the drastic way that situations like India had to deal with, where every kind of circulation was cut down and controlled completely. So there was not perhaps that same level of shock or the idea that like everything had to shut down. And also there had been this memory of the fact that in Yokohama Triennial of, was it 4 years ago? Whatever, 2011, what am I saying? I'm living in another planet, obviously. After the Fukushima sort of tragedy, the number of people who had come to the Triennial in that year had been much more than had been before ever. So there was this sort of idea that people, or this recognition in the Triennial, in the people who work for the Triennial or who make the Triennial happen in Japan, that perhaps this is what the city needs. It needs a situation to engage with art, to be able to see the world in different ways, and not just in the optic of that is coming to you from, say, the mainstream media, for example. And also, I think there was a recognition from our side as well that this perhaps is a moment of reckoning, where we have this idea that we can return perhaps to the time before is not going to be so straightforward, that this is not a question of let's put this on hold because 4 months later, 6 months later, we can go back to it being as it used to be. I think there was a sort of, all of these things were on the table, that this is how we have to now negotiate. Every day we now hear more scientists talking about the number of, say, animal to human migration of viruses is going to increase, that we're going to see a lot more of this. There is no vaccine. There is this idea that we can contain it by just controlling populations, in ways that are not necessarily even feasible. Like, they're not feasible, and also they're not the right way to do things where people are concerned. So there's, and we've had, I'm sure that I was just speaking about some of the consequences that we've had to deal with of that. As a matter of fact, one of the arguments that is understood why the numbers in India are rising so much is possibly because so many people migrated suddenly, to the hinterlands, and which is where the spread of the pandemic is right now really very intense. So I think it's, I think it was all of these things, the sort of an understanding, or perhaps an inkling, maybe not an understanding, but an inkling that this is not so easily sort of put downable, boxable again. So how does one then think of living in this time? How does one then think of creating a context for a public, and crucially a context for a public to engage with what is art, right? And funnily enough, the fact that that the triennial, one of the key terms, sort of the key ideas that we have been thinking on for the triennial for the last 2.5 years has been the question of toxicity. How does one live with toxicity? It seems prescient, but of course, as Shubha has just pointed out, urgency is not the rubric to see things only through, and the toxicity that we have try to think through amongst the other ideas that we were thinking through for the triennial is a bigger and more complex set of ideas, but definitely right now we're living sort of through an exemplar moment of it.
Yeah, it's quite incredible how prescient that became, this concept of toxicity. And I'm wondering, how did you navigate installing the exhibition and dealing with the various art entities in Yokohama, and it must have had its challenges having to do this all virtually.
Monica, perhaps you should take that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll carry on with that. I think some of the challenges are obvious, because how does one speak across such distances? And not a single artist who is not from Japan has been able to make it to Yokohama. We could make it to Yokohama. But of course, these are logistical questions. And in a time with such technologies available to us, that you and I are talking, 12, 13 hours across from each other. This was not as hard as one imagined, but I think crucially also it had to do with the fact that there had been 1.5 years almost of a lot of interaction, a lot of sort of engagement, methods of conversation that we had been working with people. And I think that also matters a lot. What is the sort of tone of conversation, and what is the mode of trust that one can generate when one is working together, right? It is so much about that. It is, how do you trust people halfway across the world to know what you want, and to find a way to express it in the understanding that what will emerge is going to make all of us feel something more. And I think that is what has been a quite incredible experience. And the fact that it is a team that is works, it is part of a museum even otherwise. And so there was a lot of logistical support on the ground. But I think I would say that, especially now that we're coming closer to the end of the exhibition, and soon we will be going into the sort of dismounting of it, there has been enough time to introspect on how we managed to do it. And I would say a lot had to do with that, with the orders of conversation, both with the people in Yokohama and with the artists all over the world.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting model, and thinking about, as we think more about the sustainability of our kind of global art world circuit, and all of the international travel that goes along with that, and climate change, and it's very interesting to see how you were able to manage this situation from your own locality, and I think it has some lessons for us for the future of how we could continue to think about how to do things more locally, but connecting globally, but remaining maybe locally. But no, it's interesting.
Yeah. I'd just like to say that it would be a pity if once the pandemic recedes somewhat, this experience is then used to inhibit the travel of artists. And, you know, there is a tendency that I've seen. I mean, I take the point of what you're saying very seriously, that there should be always a great commitment to your surroundings. But our surroundings now are the world. And there may be a situation where particularly institutions that are well supported and have a history use this as an opportunity to say, oh, now we're going to shut down and not have people from elsewhere come in. That will be a great loss both to the hosts, because they will miss out on the exchanges that were possible. And it will also certainly be a big obstruction in the lives and careers and thought processes of artists in societies and contexts where, you know, many things are not so easy.
Yeah.
And so we should be always, for instance, Montalvo is a good example, right? Montalvo is a perfect example of the fact that you have this open-hearted view of the world. And I think that that's a great strength of the residency program at Montalvo. We benefited enormously from the time that we spent there. A whole new work came out of it. It allowed for the expansion of the horizons of our imagination, because we were in a different landscape, dealing with the redwoods and the sequoia and the desert and all of that, right? I think it's very important for artists to be able to get these opportunities. And I hope that Montalvo never, you know, has a shutdown because of, you know.
Yes. Well, thank you, Shudo. It's a point very well taken. And yeah, I don't think we have any plans to stop our international focus in the future.
I'm glad you don't, and that can be a beacon of an example for other institutions.
Oh. So I'd like to now talk a little bit about you know, your curatorial approach to the triennial. And you started with a theme. Sorry, you didn't start with a theme. You started with this set of sources, where the sources were sort of records and experiences and stories of individuals from different cultural and historical backgrounds that you then shared with artists and collaborators. And I found this so fascinating. So I'm wondering, can you tell us about the sources you selected, why you selected them, and then, you know, why did you decide to call the triennial Afterglow?
Do you want to start, Shadana? I can.
Okay.
Sorry? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of a source is very resonant when we think about sources in terms of like a water source. You know, I mean, where fresh water comes from the ground, that's where people gather and settle. Or the source of a river, for instance. I mean, it creates a kind of itinerary of desires where people want to get to a source and things come from a source. I see we've sometimes had this conversation that human bodies are actually made up of sources. If you think of your inheritances, your genetic inheritances as a set of sources, because of the way DNA, you know, makes its moves and its adventures across generations, where things reappear from a distant source, which may not have been so proximate. So there is a way in which the source acts, the source metaphor acts in space and time to allow for exciting combinations to occur. So rather than say that this is the theme, if one actually says that here's a set of playing notes, here's a set of scenarios for improvisation, here's a set of provocations, here's a set of, you know, things to play with and things to think with, then people can turn them around and do different things with them. And I think that was very much our, I mean, it started earlier. I think our understanding of the source has evolved now. But when we look back at our curatorial journey, we realize that we're often We've been doing this in the past, right?
Yeah.
We did a manifesto, we found an aluminium factory, and thinking about aluminium revealed a set of sources. When we've just done this exhibition at MACBA in Barcelona, in the open or in stealth, that actually worked explicitly with a set of sources that we then shared with the artists and invited responses to. So it also becomes a way of unraveling a bit of a give and take, a bit of, this is what I offer, so it creates its own patterns of reciprocity. I was reading just a few days ago that, one of the great aesthetic practices of the Mughal ateliers of painting was to create albums where you would find pictures, calligraphy, poetry, notes. So the artwork was not one picture. The artwork was a constellation of sources that were then presented for aesthetic joy and beauty. So it's a different way of thinking about the valence of the artwork in a relational field to other artworks. I mean, not relational aesthetics, but in a kind of network of how different things sit together and walk together. So that's one way of looking at the source.
It's so interesting, and I'm glad you mentioned your use of sources in the exhibition in open or in staff at MACBA, because I read a quotation from you about the exhibition where you're talking about sources, and you said one of the ways in which the colonial legacy deprives people everywhere, not just in ex-colonies, is through a conscious and unconscious limitation on the kind of sources that can be accessed in the course of a contemporary practice or conversation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea in terms of the types of sources that you select, and sort of what what kinds of perhaps decolonializing strategies are you thinking about when you select them?
I'll talk about this, and then Monica maybe can return to the question of the afterglow, because I don't think we should forget that. It was in your
Absolutely.
Very briefly, if you look at the source we have for this triennial in the source book, I'll mention a few of them. There's a 16th century manual for healing by looking at the stars, a stargazing manual called the Sciences of the Stars, which is for the healing of the circle of friends. And it's basically a motley combination of practical tips, skills, imaginary stories, fables, myths, and so on, which is the combination of different registers of knowledge and thinking without a hierarchy in them, means that that object itself has a set of sources within it. So it's a source with other sources. Similarly, there's a memoir by a Bengali woman, and I think we'll talk about this later, from the early 20th century. She falls in love with a Japanese merchant, goes to Japan, writes a memoir. It's an act of self-transformation. This is the source for us. There is the source of a Yokohama day laborers' meditations and rambling sort of appropriation of all of philosophy and knowledge and history and popular culture, whatever he can pick up from the local library. So he's either getting drunk at a bar, or he's getting drunk on things he's reading in the library. That's a set of sources. Now, what colonialism does is that it actually creates this false hermetic silo between you and other people. So the cultures of the world were never like that. It's only when patterns of domination in the modern world created this idea of, we are there, here is the new colonizing knowledge and power, and there are your lores and folklore, that people created these hierarchies. So in a sense, both the anxiety to be appropriately en courant with what was the inheritance of Euro-American modernity amongst intellectuals of the South, as well as either a hyper-veneration of the traditional or a complete disavowal of it. It's not the ease with which perhaps in 17th, 16th century China, Iran, India, Japan, people approach the world. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying There was a kind of fluid ease with which they approached the boundaries of the self and the world. And I think colonialism interrupts this ease. And perhaps our effort is to make it easy, make the ease happen again. It's a bit like, you know, how do you begin playing jazz again? You just do it.
Yeah.
That's the sense in which we're talking.
Very interesting. Monica, do you want to talk about the title of the exhibition, Afterglow, and how that relates to the sources?
Sure. I was actually, while Shraddha was talking about it, I was reminded of this other piece of work that actually we had done many years ago called 36 Planes of Emotion, where one of the, so it's a work which used what seemed like these cubes of acrylic, and they have these collective nouns that we generated, we imagined up for experiences. And the reason I refer to that is because you know, we know, for example, the fact that we never feel one experience, one emotional state at a time, right? There's always, you might be, so we say we are happy, but we're not only happy. We are maybe more happy, but then there's always at least a few other things, affectively, emotively, things that we are thinking and feeling that are going through us at any point of time. And I think this is one of the other moments when we had this realization that we are in this habit. And I think the word habit has to be looked at. What are we habituated to and why? We are habituated to a certain mode of expression, a certain mode of reading the world, which insists on a sort of singularity, a singularity of affect, a singularity of meaning, a singularity of connection. While we all know, you know, sort of within that, actually, there's a lot more other things, but we have learned to sort of to diminish its own affect for ourselves. And I think this is part of. I come to it from a different direction when I'm talking like this, but I think you will like. This is, in a sense, one can understand the same way of thinking about how one feels the world, how one thinks the world, what comes to one, and how can then one respond and react to it. And actually the word afterglow is one of those words, again, which carries within itself so much, right? It is a word of great sort of beauty, because there is the afterglow of a sunset, there is the afterglow of an orgasm, there is the afterglow of something you might have seen or felt. After image connects to that. I mean, cinema is, after all, the after image. So all of these things are the positive things, all these things you think of. But also we know that there is an afterglow after, there is the afterglow of a nuclear event. There is the afterglow of tragedy in that sense. There's the Cherenkov radiation, which is the sort of situation that happens when, after a nuclear event, when there are things that you cannot see with your naked eye, but you can only see them, and they go straight to your eyeball, isn't it? To the back of your, so your mind
slowed down.
Yeah, your mind, in a sense, sees a light that your eyes physically cannot see. So we were thinking about all of those things. And of course, the fact is that, and at the very kind of, we are of that generation who saw, when we were kids, and you waited for the TV channels to start telecasting. But before that or after that, there would be snow. And we thought of that snow as just an absence of image, but actually that snow is the remnant of the Big Bang. It is the afterglow of the beginning of everything. So when we were thinking about all of these kind of things, we were connecting both the fact that we feel multiply, we think multiply, the world comes to us multiply, and that how does one express simultaneously all of these things, and the fact that, as I was saying earlier, that how does one live with toxicity? How does one acknowledge the fact that you have to live with something which is both, which can be simultaneously extraordinarily beautiful, which, was all the spectrum from life to an explosion, but also the fact that it is an extremely toxic it has extremely toxic after effects. And all these things connect. So I think it is that feeling of the connected network that is the afterglow.
Yeah, I so appreciate the sort of the complexity that you kind of introduce to these ideas, and it makes me think about how you've described your work as a kind of active kinetic contemplation, where you have a lot of different ideas at play, interacting with one another. And you also mentioned in the source book about creating a thicket. And I wonder if you could just briefly touch on that concept, and then perhaps we could move into looking at some of the artwork that you presented as the Triennial and explore a little bit how the sources resonated with artists.
I think we are often trying to find a mode to express how we all live intellectually, affectively. I mean, Raqs has written that for us there is no distinction between. So we have written about the feeling of thought. Like there is an intellectual ecstasy, something I've read in texts that go back 2,000 years from our part of the world. So hard, but like I was saying, this need for singular expression. And the fact that when you try and say that there's many layers to everything, and there's a kind of there can be a reaction that says, but it gets so complicated. But the fact is, it's not. And one of the metaphors, or one of the metaphors for this kind of is the word thicket, because we can actually visualize it in our minds immediately. When some of those expressive words, you say thicket, and you can see it in your eyes.
Yes.
And you know exactly what it feels like. The fact that things are all like growing all around you, they're extremely connected. You have to make your way through either by following a line through that, or sometimes cutting through it. So a thicket is to be in a thicket. That is what, and that is what I think we always are. And actually we made a work again around that idea, but we decided to ask people to literalize it for themselves. So it was at the, what is that new building in the Tate Hall? Anyway, we asked people to draw in space, and with paper tape, and it became like this. So over time, over a week, over days, and it grew much faster. It was a bit slow in the beginning, but it grew really fast after that. They became this thicket of blue. I wish I could show you a picture, but maybe you can take a look at it afterwards. And it also connected to this other image that we have. Some years ago, we invited a friend of ours, a coder, to code how our computers spoke to each other just over the span of an afternoon. But of course, when my computer speaks to Shuddha's computer, or I send an email to him, it is going through around the world, right? It's pinging to so many places. When I do a search in my studio, again, I'm speaking to so many histories, of course, but also literally so many nodal points. It is Indira's jal, connected. All things are connected and woven into each other, reflected in each other. So the image that emerged from that was again of these kind of every point is connected to every other point in so many multiple ways. And actually that is what we live with all the time. We just think it's one computer speaking to, I just think it's me speaking to Shuddha. I just think it's me sending him an email. But actually I'm speaking to the whole world at the same time.
Yeah. I have seen images of the Tate project, so we could post a link to that in the description, and we'll also post a link to the source book as well, so that people can have a look at that and read more of this.
Yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. So why don't we now have a look at some of the artworks from the show, and I'm gonna just share my screen now so that I can show some images from PowerPoint. Here we go. And perhaps you can talk us, so this is the image of the source book. Perhaps you can talk us through some of the works that we're seeing, and maybe we can dig in a little bit into in what ways these works resonate with the source books. I know some of these works were new commissions, some of them were, existing work. And we've got about 5 different pieces, or 4 or 5 different pieces that we can look at together. So do you want to start with this piece?
Sure.
Here?
Yeah, it's a very striking piece, this by Fumiaki, which looks like boats at different levels of the sea. You know, if you think of the sea as a set of cascading waves, and these boats are arranged on the different levels of the waves, but they're boats made out of both the driftwood of doors, in a sense. So at the same time, it's foraged, it's found, and these are the portals to people's lives, or have been portals to people's lives. I don't want to think of this work as responding to a source, but I do want to think of a source as responding to this work. Let's do it the other way, right?
Yes.
So I mentioned briefly in passing this memoir of extraordinary memoir of a woman called Horiprabha Takeda. She was from a small town, a very provincial context in eastern Bengal, now Bangladesh. She fell in love with this Japanese merchant and crossed halfway across the world to live with him and his family, married him and moved at a time when this was considered impossible. I mean, it was not an easy thing for a non-elite young woman who was not from an aristocratic or a high bourgeois milieu in India to say that I'm going to actually traverse the world and go elsewhere because that's where love takes me. She goes there, and then she begins writing this memoir of the transformation of her life, and how she learns a new idiom of living. So one of the things that interested us throughout this process was autodidacticism. It was, one of the other sources, Kimitsu Nishikawa was the Japanese day laborer, who was this great autodidact. So Horiprabha Takeda became an autodidact of a new form of life. And we think of this maritime journey, this crossing of the seas, which in an Indian Hindu context, she was not Hindu, but it's this culture that surrounds her, would have been considered losing your identity. But instead of losing her identity and being cursed by the crossing of the seas, we could say she found many identities. She found many selves. And these eccentric boats that are also doors, that are also driftwood, that are also the gift of the sea to the land and a way of making a house, make me think that there is a connection between the source and the work, the other way around in a way.
That's beautiful. Yeah. We have another.
Yeah, which is really, it's a house now, isn't it? It's like, is it inside? Is it outside? Is it furniture? Is it walls? Is it sliding? Is it shutting doors? Is it opening doors? It's a remarkable.
And to me, I find really quite something is the fact that the forms refuse to stay with the condition they're given. The boat refuses to stay above, the table refuses to stay above. They wish to be contaminated of each other. There is that kind of propulsion, I think, which is quite, which again, surrounds us. And it is very interesting to see how this morphing, this contamination creates new life forms, or new forms at least.
And I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but this was reclaimed from a village that was destroyed during
during the
tsunami.
Yeah.
Which I thought was just very powerful to see that.
So it's the afterglow of a storm still.
Yeah, and that something remains. It's beautiful. Well, I mean, we talk much longer with you about this piece, but in the interest of time, let's move on to this work, Nick Cave's Kinetics Spin Forest. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this piece and why why you wanted to include it.
When we so of course when you make an exhibition of the scale of a triennial, so much is pushed and sort of propelled by what you're sort of exploring along, as a curatorial collective, but also with artists, but also of course the specificity of the site, right? The Yokohama Museum, which is such a building, and it's an important architectural kind of moment in the history of architecture in Japan. But what is really interesting is that I remember when we walked into this, and we said, what happens? What about, like, so if you see the first work that as you walk to the building, it's a very sort of solid 80s kind of Takeda building, and it's quite sort of heavy. And the first thing we had said was, what would happen if the building could disappear? And I remember, and so when then we had invited Ivana to the piece that she has made, this kind of cloaking piece for the entire facade, which creates a kind of dizzy moire effect. So it really does feel like the building is a light
Shimmering.
kind of shimmering structure, as opposed to the gray heavy structure that it was. And I remember the second thing we had said was, what if the whole thing explodes when you walk inside? And one of the sort of starting points for that, of course, so for inviting spinner forest, kinetic spinner forest, was that feeling. So when you walk inside, it is a very high atrium, and you are surrounded by what looks like a kind of kinetic, dizzying landscape of color, and the notion of scale is completely lost. You don't know where you are. You don't know how tall or how small the surroundings are. And also, so it is that moment of destabilization, of course, because also this building architecture was meant to allow a movement through for anyone to walk through the building, actually, not just those who are buying tickets. So it's also interesting. It does, so as you walk inside the building, it suddenly changes scale, it changes form. And then the color, it seems so beautiful, but then again, when you pay attention to what you're actually surrounded by, you realize that within the kind of, within the spinning figures, you see the guns, you see the tears, you see the bullets. It, of course, speaks to so many of the things that we are living through in the world right now, especially, of course, in the United States, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the things that, the amazing, incredible sort of challenges that people have felt, and the responses that they have made, that it speaks to all of that. But as Nick would himself say, it doesn't speak it from, perhaps I'm speaking for him, that would be incorrect, but I definitely think it has the capacity to ask you to look at that, to look at things, to re-look at things, crucially, not just to look at them, and to re-look at them, and to find things that are unexpected. Where you expect to find something, you will find something else. That, I think, holds for the entire situation in the world right now. And I just want to, it's not, one important thing for us definitely in the exhibition making has been, just as the sources had to break hierarchy and location, and the fact that we have sources from all over, from different times and different places, it was also very important for us to have artists from different places in the world. And it was very important to have someone of Nick Cave's capacity of work, obviously, but also I think there has not been a person an African-American person or a person from Africa in the Yokohama Triennale today, or till this week.
Really? Yeah. That's very, very important. Yeah, well, when I was looking at this image, and it really did make me think about your description of a thicket as well. It feels like that sort of very...
It is a thicket, yeah.
Yeah, even though I've unfortunately not been able to experience it in person, just seeing it in the image really conveys that idea beautifully. And then also sort of the beauty, magic of it, but then within it there's just these sort of terrible tragedy too at the heart side. So I was excited to see this piece. Can you tell us about this work by Make or Break?
Yeah, so Make or Break, we actually, they live in Australia, and so they were able to actually visit and come spend time in Yokohama, even in February, March time, because it was a different lateral, the different longitudes, we were able to navigate still a little bit longer. And they spent actually a few weeks in Yokohama. And they have a very interesting practice where they are interested in sort of asking people in a way, I suppose, like a little bit like what you're saying. When you look at something, you don't just see for example, the commodity. You don't just see the commodity, you see the value of the labor that has gone into it. So one of their projects is about working with artists in a context to create work of art that is sold in the shop of the museum, for example. But when people come to buy it, they have to talk about what they think it's worth. And then the conversation becomes about the worth of a work, what is the time, and what is the kind of value that is ascribed. So that is something that they're very interested in. Their practice is about opening out those kind of conversations. In Yokohama, what they were really moved by were the bridges. So there are so many of these bridges across canals in the city, these metallic bridges. So the piece installation itself has kind of renditions of bridge forms. And what you would do, as it's an interactive piece where you can take a spray bottle full of salt water and spray it. So of course, if we are connected to this, of course, we're not far from the sea over here, and there is that attritive action that is happening from the atmosphere. So again, but how do you, because another thing, the third most important, not most important, but definitely one of the most important things in the kind of ideas for us was living with toxicity while you care for friends. That is something that's, when you go through the source book as well, Svetlana Boehm's text looking at the luminosity of friendship and the care of friends, which is also what Nujum al-Ulum is about, the science of the stars, which is knowledge for the care of friends. So they were really interested in the question. Also, they were sort of responding and thinking through some of the sources that we had offered, and they said, so what happens when the bottle you spray with, the salt water that you spray the bridge foam with, will also destroy the bridge foam that you are spraying it with. So your care to clean the bridge foam is also destroying the bridge foam. How do you negotiate that? How do you live with that understanding? It's a really thoughtful, not an interactive, what would you call it? It's like an action piece in the museum. Yeah, in the museum.
Long duration action piece.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this sort of expanded idea of friendship, that's not just about human to human, but it's about all of it, and all of inanimate and other sorts of non-human creatures. Thinking about how we care for these structures that support us and sustain us, and it's really beautiful and very important. And then just sort of the whole bridging as a sort of metaphor of how we connect to one another, and how important that is for us to find ways to do that now more than ever.
It's really nice. Yeah, it's very nice to speak to you, Donna, because of the kind of care you bring to the reading of the artwork that you're doing so far away. It's, that care is as important as any other care.
Oh, well, thank you. It's just been such a wonderful treat for me to experience this work with you and delve into more of your practice. So, okay, so let's have a look at a couple more images. Can you talk us through this piece?
Kei Takemura, she lives not in any of the big cities. She's a wonderful artist who has a sort of broad range of practice. But one of the things, so just want to take you on a little journey, because when we talked about toxicity and luminosity, from luminosity we went into the luminosity of friendship, but then there was also the bioluminescence and the fact that creatures, especially underwater, but not only like fireflies, of course, but they glow when they want to morse to each other co-presence, but also when they want to morse warning. So we also went into looking at Osei Shimura's, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in bioluminescence of jellyfish. This is another source, actually, in the source book. And she works, it was a completely serendipitous discovery. She works with bioluminescent thread. She has that spun, and she covers not only objects of everyday use, but also especially objects of everyday use, wraps them up and stitches with this bioluminescent thread. So it's a very special viewing experience, because it is lit by blue light, but then you see it through, in actual, when you walk into the room that the work is in, you have to see this through the slits where there's an orange filter, and then these threads glow. So again, how you see something it permits you. So this is actually a view through the orange filter band. So how you see something permits you to see what was invisible otherwise. It literalizes that. And like every extraordinary act of the imagination that materializes it for friends, for all the publics, you are able to sort of literally see the attentiveness and care and literally care and repair that she's interested in as a life practice. And part of the piece is also live performances of her doing this when she feels like it.
Yes, it's a beautiful piece. This sort of bioluminescence idea, I mean, this may not be relevant, but it was reminding me yesterday, I heard on the radio that they've discovered these possible signatures of life on
Venus.
Yeah.
On Venus, I know.
Yeah. And it's this chemical, phosphine, I think. Phosphine, that's produced in places that you might think of as toxic, right? Like sewage plants and swamps, and that it has a kind of glow. And in fact, there's evidence that those sort of apparitions that sometimes you see of swamps, like will-o'-the-wisp type ghosts, are from this chemical. This whole bioluminescence in this piece really, I was thinking about that a lot when I heard about that on the radio.
I mean, we were very aware of, sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, can I just add that there's actually a piece by the artist Oscar Santillan. He has two pieces, but one of the pieces that he has is a sculpture which is of soil, what would I say, like soil that would have been if it was from Venus. So he's literally composed soil, brought it together, looking at the chemical composition of Venus, and made these kind of organic looking forms. I don't remember the exact name of the work, but it says it is called like soil from Venus, or clay from Venus. So yesterday we were all kind of having little things exploding in our brain when I heard about this phosphine.
And I mean, we write in the source book itself, in the note on bioluminescence, that where astrobiologists to look for signatures of life on other planets, they would be looking, in fact, for bioluminescence, because those are, there's an exchange of gases involved, which can only happen if there is some kind of metabolic process at work, either now or historically. So those glows are certainly the afterglow, could be the afterglow of life. Not necessarily the glow.
Yes, so fascinating. Okay, so let's just move on to this final image, and we have this shot, but then we can also toggle to some images on Instagram. But can you tell us about this piece?
Certainly. This is a work by Masaru Iwai, and actually it's not just a work, it's also an episodo. Episodos are kind of points of emphasis that we're creating around the exhibition, both before, during, and in a way after the exhibition as well, which are points of intensity and exploration of a certain set of ideas in different forms. But so Masaru actually has been interested in the question of cleaning for quite some time. As a matter of fact, he had worked as a person who signed up and went to work as a volunteer in Fukushima in the cleaning of the streets and removing of the soil and all the little, basically everything on the streets was cleaned. These pictures are quite extraordinary. People spending days just cleaning the streets, taking every little bit away with little brushes, putting them in these black trash bags, really, and piling them up in a mound to be buried, but not very far. So the complexity and irony and the beauty of all of this, the beauty of the people working in that amazing way, and the fact that all it has happened is that it has been hidden. And so he's very interested in the question of what is it that is being cleaned, why it's being cleaned, what is it going to lead towards, what is sort of intention of that, and so the question that arises from the question of cleaning. And so his piece is actually an incredible expanding piece, and it expands every day because anyone can sign up to be to join the Broom Star. So the piece is called Broom Stars. You can be a Broom Star. He will send you a mask that he has made, these paper bag masks, where you can, which you can modify as you like to sort of personalize them. And you can take pictures of yourself cleaning, and you can put them on Instagram especially, and they also show up on the Yokohama Triennale website with the hashtag Broomstars. And I have to say, you know, much as I was conceptually moved by the piece, I have just been, it's incredible to see the kind of transformation of the mask, which of course is, you know, again, when the whole idea started, the idea of the mask was not such a central part of our imagination then. Now, you know, now the mask has become the metaphor for the 2020, for all, yes. So this is the mask that he originated. This is the paper bag mask that you get. But as you can see, and there are cleaning performances in the museum as well. You can sign up and clean the museum as a kind of, not as a viewed piece, but just as an experience piece. But this is also what people are doing just everywhere. And you know, it would be worth looking at the fact that in Japan, especially since the Second World War, there has been a great attentiveness to the question of self-cleaning, or especially, so there's videos on the internet where children are shown cleaning their classrooms. Also, there's that moment in the World Cup football when the Japanese fans cleaned up the stadium before they left, and left the stadium as clean as when they had come to it. So there is, especially in the last 70, 80 years, there's been a great emphasis on that. But I think this is what Masaru is interested in, is just sort of asking us to look at it as the kind of an action of beauty that it is, an action of care. It is a care of friends. It is a care of what we live surrounded by, and what we are able to give back to it as much as what we take from it. And it's turning into, it is turning into one of the most extraordinary pieces of work in the Triennial. Yeah.
Well, yes, and it really resonates with this sort of idea of essential work and our kind of rediscovery, for want of a better word, of how important that is to our ability to sustain ourselves. And I think definitely at the beginning of the pandemic in the US, there was a real recognition of that. It seems, unfortunately, a little bit to be fading from people's minds. But yeah, that we need to value this work in a different way than we have in the past. And I'm mindful of time, and I'd like to bring Kelly back on with us to have some like little follow-up questions. But while I do that, thinking about that idea, I'd like, you know, to ask you about what you've been talking about our sort of failure to deal with toxicity, or our inability to coexist with it. And beyond the work that you've kind of shown in the exhibition, what are you taking away from thinking about platforms and technologies that can enable processes of care for us, and what role can the imagination play in how we can really start to think about that in a deeper and more transformative way? Hi, Kelly. Thanks for coming back.
There. Thank you. This was fascinating. Why don't I let you answer Donna's question? I just, you know, all of these layers is exactly the life we're living at this moment. And it's really kind of beautiful way to look at it. It's complicated. People want a straight line. Mm-hmm. And I think what's become quite obvious, especially for us in the States, is there isn't a straight line. Kind of this idea of colonialism, wanting one thread and covering up the sources. I feel like that's what our work is today, is uncovering many of the stories of our own sort of history here in the States, and doing this globally starts to become such a rich tapestry of who we are as a humanity. It's really, it's a beautiful project.
Thank you. You've asked a really good, challenging question, Donna, and I will take it directly, I guess, from what we've just been looking at, which is how much value we give something is going to be what we're going to take from it as well, right? If something is, so for a moment, as you pointed out, we might have all been aware of the fact of essential work as being the most crucial work of keeping us alive. And yet again, it just seems to have elided, we are eliding over it. But just as a kind of, just as a principle, if you think something is more valuable dead, if a whale is more valuable dead than it is alive, then the whale will be found dead. It will be killed because it is going to give, because what is valuable is not what the whale's presence is, but the whale's dead body. I take that actually riffing off because I was just watching this film, The Social Dilemma, where in a sense they're asking the same question. It's a film which is sort of looking at social media and saying, but why is it that we are not able to see it for what it is? And the fact is, you know, we can call it sort of structures of governance, we can call it structures of capitalism, we can look at it as surveillance, or as Dibesh has recently formulated, scavenging capitalism, where it's literally cleaning over whatever is left alive in these days of death and desperation, and still seeking to profit from that. The point is, if we don't give value to the things that need to be given value to, there's not going to be any kind of magical, transformation. And the reason that I think the act of the imagination is important is because it rescinds that sense of the habituated. We talked about this earlier as well. If you think this is, it asks us to look at things again, and it says, well, can you see it for what else it also is? Can you find its other meanings, its other values? That is the act of the imagination. That is pretty much the only role that imagination is presently playing that is challenging things as far as I can make out. But what do you think, Shika?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of, this question of a platform where all the layers, which are intimate, which are bodily, which are also worldly, planetary, intersect. I was just thinking of this work that we just finished making some days ago called 31 Days. And I think you have a image of it. It might be interesting to pull it up while I talk about it. So 31 Days it takes the form of notes in a letter. So like in an email, you say, to me, CC all, subject 31 days. So it's about a span of time, this span of time. And we like to we're calling it a handwritten film because it is about handwriting. And I think that many of us are going back to routines, about tasks that structure time. And Monica started writing, doing calligraphy exercises, working with pen and paper, which was, I think, quite a wonderful thing to see her. And she would send us little, notes and video from her phone of what she'd just written. And we felt that this was actually a conversation. And it was also riffing off the passages and the little things that we send each other all the time, things that we've observed. Like when the lockdown happened, I had to ferry a nurse back and forth because my mother had an injury and because she could not travel. So I had a special pass and I could travel in the city. So I was one of the very few people driving in the city of 20 million. And that was an incredible experience. So I may have been one of the first people to see the migrants move, the workers move. And it was a rainy evening and I saw people walking in the rain. It's that strange expression, tears in the rain, right? And it was little notes of these things that actually made us create a picture of this time in this world, and many times in many worlds, that I think is actually this business of, this is the work of art. It's what Monica said. It's to crystallize at a given moment an imagination that opens up into many worlds and many times. So if I read just maybe the first 5 fragments from 31 Days, begins with, a chicken farm bites the edge of a forest. A factory worker buys duck soup. A nurse falls asleep after 3 continuous shifts. An elephant gets lost in a village. A migrant pregnant woman feels feverish. 1 gram of an unliving thing multiplies across thousands of bodies. A leopard meets a lynch mob. In the space station 250 miles above, 2 astronauts and a cosmonaut float. 45 musicians log in across time zones to play together. Outside a high-rise window, there are flamingos everywhere. So, and it goes on. And the 1 gram of an unliving thing is actually a reference to the virus, because we read a bizarre but precise and accurate calculation of the actual weight of the virus, and it's not more than a few grams.
Wow.
Even now.
Wow.
Like if you were to put all the virus particles in on a weighing machine, it would be a few grams. And it's a few grams of this unliving thing that has actually changed our sense of scale and perspective. Now, that's an observation that a scientist has made. But to turn it into an epiphany about the nature of the world and how things matter in it is the work of art. And this is what we're talking about when we say that these are the ways in which it's like the tectonic plates of different knowledge systems and different ways of feeling and thinking about the world sort of rustle and crackle against each other. That's the platform that we are searching for.
Yes.
Seems to me that you found it. I mean, you certainly, and congratulations on the triennial. Congratulations on getting there in this moment. Such an easy moment for so many people, just shut down and quit whatever they were working on, with an impossibility of how to sort of achieve the task at hand, and coming at it through this is fascinating. I wonder, just in closing, I'm so curious about your own process. You spoke about the residency and the value of that kind of space. And I think what we see happening in the residency so often is artists meeting, coming together and forming collaboratives that then grow out of that space. And you came to us as a collaborative, and you've been working as a collaborative. So how you bring all of these pieces together in your thinking, I'd be really curious about that kind of life that you've now had together for so many years.
Oh, it's almost the easiest and the toughest one, It's like we've been working together for more than 25 years. We were film students, that's how we met, in film school. And there is that tradition of cinema which said that you need to be working together to create a film, which I think we took on probably more than most other people in the world, and said, fine, we will work together and see what emerges from that. And elsewhere we've spoken about the mathematics of a collective, that it is not addition, it is, I don't know, multiplication, I suppose, or some other form of exponential transformation. At least it feels like that to us. And we have said that Raqs is our first artwork, and then Raqs is the artist. So 3 of us are constituents, both the authors of the first work and also we're not the artist in a way. Yeah, we are the work in us. So, and I think it is the capacity for conversation, probably because we come from a chatty kind of, or the fact that maybe because you're pre-internet, I don't know, we talk a lot. But I think it's also the fact that there is a kind of, a confidence in the fact that what will emerge when the 3 of us make something together. Not just the 3 of us. So Raqs collaborates with many other people too. We've collaborated with, coders and theater directors and writers and, all sorts of people. Is that conversations always lead to interesting things. They always lead to sort of a shift. That shift might be a long sort of dilation, or it might be an intense little blip, but the point is it is a shift. And how does one live in that and experience that is a form of kinetic contemplation, which is in a way our translation of the word Raqs.
I mean, I'd just like to go back to our Montalvo experience, because I think it says something. Monica mentioned this. There's a different mathematics of time. And in our case, I think there is a multiplication of time. So it's actually 25 years into 3, that's 75 years, right? Now, what a residency does is that it is, well, also plus, in this case, plus, plus is the multiplication sign. But what a residency does is that it actually gives you another residency, Pirana Cavalchini, who's at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, said to us when she presented us with the possibility of residencies, she said, all I'm giving you is the gift of time. I think Montalvo also gave us a gift of time. And in that time, we had the ability to both slow things down as well as quicken them. So one of the things that got quickened was a sudden memory of a film that all of us had seen in film school by a Bengali film director who was very dear to us, Ritik Ghatak, which had a sequence in an abandoned airfield where there were rusting airplanes. And it was being in California, suddenly the revelation occurred to us. We're actually not very far from the biggest airfield where there are abandoned airplanes, which is in the Mojave Desert. There's a massive collection of rusting airplanes, and a whole new work came out of that. So it was a time to remember a catalytic work for us, which then became the opportunity of proximity to a different space, which is you were a day's drive away from the Mojave Desert. And we said to each other, we may never again be a day's drive away from the Mojave Desert. We should take this opportunity. So that time and that space, that space-time continuum, a door opened, a portal opened, and we were in the different universe of the Mojave Desert with these rusting airplanes. And I think that's what it did. That's what the question of what happens when three people who have a shared memory, who have a lot of time together, and who have a particular space to be in. And that's what it does.
Just want to, last thought on that is that what emerged from that was a piece thinking on anacoustic reason. Now, this is what I think is what is interesting, is the fact that, the three people who are sitting together and have the opportunity to go someplace which is nearby. But what we began to think about was what happens when acoustic, we know, that which causes us to listen to something, to hear something. Anacoustic is that which deadens sound, which does not allow listening. And I think the fact that as a collective who find centrality in speech, but also in listening to each other, the idea that what is it that does not listen and cannot listen. And so the piece was actually called A Measure of Anacoustic Reason. That, I think, brings all these ideas together.
That's fantastic. Great story. There's so much more to talk about. And we are done.
Well, I was just thinking that I really hope we can start our book project up again, because we would love to hear more about that Montalvo residency experience. We were talking about that, so I hope we can circle back to that at some point. But I just want to, I want to thank you so much, Monica and Shida, for your time. It's just been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm just so delighted to have had a chance to get to know you and your work much better. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been
Thank
a
you,
delightful
Donna. Thank you,
conversation.
Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. This was a treat for us.
Kelly, do you want to tell our audience what we have coming up for Scratch Base?
Absolutely. So next week with Scratch Face, we'll be joined by musician and writer Lex Brown and performance artist, comedian, and writer Christina Wong for a wide-ranging conversation on dismantling internalized and external racism and sexism through art and humor. We'll discuss how Brown and Wong draw on personal experiences to explore large-scale systems of power and create performance experiences that blur the roles of artist and audience, as well as explore the values of articulating blueprints for imaginary futures. Please join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.